If you think losing your memory is simply what happens when you get old, I want you to stay with me because I spent most of my life believing the same thing. I have watched people in their 90s remember the smallest details from 70 years ago while forgetting what they had for breakfast. And I have watched other people remain curious, talkative, and independent when everyone around them expected them to slow down. What frightened me was not that these people were different, but that the difference often seemed to begin with things so ordinary that nobody noticed them. A conversation interrupted by a television, a walk skipped because the weather was inconvenient, a meal eaten alone again and again, a hobby quietly abandoned, a night of broken sleep accepted with a shrug, a mind that never truly rests because it is carrying yesterday, tomorrow, and everything in between. None of these moments looks dangerous. That is exactly why I became interested in them. I am over 90 now, and I have lived long enough to watch several generations grow old in very different ways. I have lost dear friends whose minds remained bright almost until the end, and I have known others who became confused and withdrawn much earlier than anyone expected. I cannot tell you that lifestyle determines everything, because I am not a doctor, and I would never pretend that genes, illness, chance, or circumstances do not matter. But I can tell you what I have noticed again and again. The people who seem to protect their independence often protected a few simple parts of everyday life without even thinking of them as health habits. The most surprising part is that the first habit is something many of us are actually proud of doing. I was proud of it too. I thought I was being efficient, useful, and clever. It took me years to understand that my busy little habit might be making it harder for me to remember the very things I was trying so hard to keep up with. And once I understood that, I began noticing the same pattern everywhere around me. I first started paying attention to this when I was living near the coast and spending mornings with people who had known one another for decades. I remember one neighbor, Margaret, who could tell me exactly what her husband had said to her on their first date, yet she would sometimes walk into the kitchen and forget why she had gone there. She laughed about it and called it age. I laughed with her because I did not want to make her worry. But privately, I wondered whether something else was happening. Then there was Samuel, an old friend from church, who could barely sit through a meal without checking the newspaper, listening to the radio, answering a phone call, and talking to whoever was beside him. He used to say, "My mind is still sharp because I keep it busy." I believed him for a long time. Then one afternoon, I watched him tell the same story twice in 10 minutes without realizing it. That stayed with me. Researchers who study attention have found that what we call multitasking is often rapid switching between tasks, rather than the brain truly doing several things at once. That constant switching can make it harder to give new information enough attention to become a strong memory. I began testing this in my own life. I stopped reading while the television was talking in the background. When someone called me, I put down what I was doing instead of half listening while folding laundry. I started giving one activity my full attention for 20 minutes. Something very simple happened. I remembered conversations better. I noticed details I had been missing. Even my walks felt different because I was looking at the houses, hearing the birds, and actually noticing where I was. That led me to another observation. The people I knew who kept walking rarely talked about walking as exercise. They simply went somewhere. They walked to the mailbox, around the block, down the waterfront, or through a garden. Regular light physical activity is associated with better circulation and with healthy aging, and I found that reassuring because walking does not require a membership, a machine, or youth. But then I noticed something even more important. The people who walked usually had somewhere to go, and very often someone to see. That made me wonder whether the real secret was not movement alone, but what movement kept alive? I did not understand the answer until I began looking at the way people ate their meals. There was a woman named Elena, whom I met through friends from several different countries, and she changed the way I thought about an ordinary lunch. Elena was in her late 80s and still invited people into her kitchen almost every week. Her meals were not fancy. There might be soup, beans, vegetables, fruit, bread, and whatever she had growing outside. What fascinated me was that she almost never ate alone. Someone was always sitting across from her: a granddaughter, a neighbor, a friend, sometimes just one person with a cup of tea. She told me that food tasted better when somebody was listening. I thought she was simply being sentimental, but after watching her for years, I began to understand there was something more practical happening. Conversation asks you to listen, remember what another person just said, find an answer, tell your own story, and follow the thread. It is gentle mental work hidden inside ordinary life. Research on aging has associated regular social engagement with better cognitive outcomes, although researchers are still studying exactly why the connection exists. I saw enough of it myself to stop dismissing it. Then I noticed another quiet change that often came before people seemed to lose their spark. They stopped doing the things they loved. A man who had repaired clocks for 50 years stopped touching his tools. A woman who played piano every afternoon closed the lid and never opened it again. Another friend stopped gardening because she decided she was too old to learn anything new. That last sentence bothered me deeply. Too old to learn? I could not accept it. Researchers sometimes talk about cognitive reserve, meaning the mental resilience built through years of learning and engaging with challenging activities. I am not suggesting a hobby can prevent disease because I cannot promise that. But I have watched curiosity keep people engaged with life. A puzzle, a book, music, gardening, painting, learning a few words in another language, even figuring out a new phone can give the mind something to work with. And here is the part that surprised me most. You do not have to become good at the activity. You only have to remain interested enough to keep trying. I once learned to use a computer from a teenager who laughed every time I clicked the wrong thing. I was terrible at it, but I kept learning because I wanted to send photographs to family members. That small decision taught me something I still carry today. A mind does not need a perfect challenge. It needs a reason to stay awake. And just when I thought curiosity was the answer, I began noticing a different problem in people who had plenty of activities around them. It was not always lack of exercise or lack of conversation that worried me. Sometimes it was too much empty time without anything that truly engaged the mind. I knew people who spent nearly the whole day sitting in front of television programs they did not even enjoy. They watched because the television was there. They would tell me they were resting, but when I asked what they had seen, they often could not remember. I do not believe television is the enemy, and I certainly enjoy a good program myself. The difference, I think, is whether we are choosing something or simply letting the hours happen to us. There is a quiet difference between resting your mind and abandoning it. I saw this especially after retirement. Work had once given people schedules, conversations, decisions, problems to solve, and reasons to get dressed in the morning. Then suddenly all of that disappeared. Some people replaced it with gardening, volunteering, reading, cards, church, grandchildren, or learning something new. Others simply became less involved with the world. The change could be surprisingly gradual. First, they stopped going out. Then they stopped calling people. Then they stopped reading. Then they stopped asking questions. I remember thinking, when did their world become so small? That question stayed with me. Another habit that quietly affected people was sleep. I used to believe that broken sleep was simply the price of getting older. Now I am much less casual about it. During deep sleep, The brain carries out important restorative processes, and research has linked persistent poor sleep with several markers associated with cognitive aging. That does not mean one bad night will harm your memory. I have had plenty of bad nights myself. It means that years of repeatedly broken or shallow sleep deserve attention rather than being dismissed as inevitable. I found that keeping my waking time reasonably consistent helped me more than obsessing over the exact moment I went to bed. Morning light, gentle movement, less evening stimulation, and a calm bedroom became more important to me than chasing some perfect number of hours. But there was one more problem I kept seeing, and it was much harder to recognize because it did not look like a habit at all. It looked like responsibility. It looked like caring. It looked like being strong. People carried worries quietly for years and called it normal life. I did too. I would lie awake thinking about family, money, illness, old mistakes, and things that had not even happened yet. I thought worrying meant I was preparing myself. Eventually, I wondered whether I was actually training my body to remain tense. And that question led me to the final habit, the one I believe deserves the most gentle attention. I remember one particular winter when I realized how much quiet stress I had been carrying. I was not facing a single disaster. That would have been easier to understand. It was 100 little concerns, each one small enough to ignore, but together they followed me everywhere. I worried about relatives. I worried about bills. I worried about whether I was becoming a burden. I worried about things I had said 30 years earlier. At night, my body was tired, but my mind kept working. I would wake and immediately begin solving imaginary problems. I thought this was simply what responsible people did. Then I watched a friend named Clara change after her husband died. At first, she was overwhelmed by grief, and nobody expected her to feel well. But slowly, she created small, peaceful rituals. She sat outside with her tea. She prayed. She watered her plants. She took short walks without carrying her phone. She called one person every afternoon. She told me, "I cannot control everything, but I can give my mind somewhere quiet to sit." I never forgot that sentence. Researchers studying long-term stress have found associations between persistent stress and changes in brain areas involved in memory and attention. That does not mean stress causes every memory problem, and I would never tell someone that simply relaxing can solve a medical condition. But I have seen enough to believe that protecting moments of calm is a reasonable part of caring for yourself. My own version is very simple. Sometimes I breathe slowly for 5 minutes. Sometimes I sit in my garden and pull weeds. Sometimes I pray. Sometimes I walk without trying to reach anywhere. I am not trying to become perfectly calm. I am simply giving my body a few minutes when it does not have to be on guard. There is another lesson I learned from watching older people. They often did not make 7 changes at once. They made one change and repeated it until it became part of them. One woman started walking after breakfast. Another began sharing lunch with her sister twice a week. A retired carpenter opened his workshop for 10 minutes every afternoon. Someone else began reading 2 pages before bed. These actions looked almost too small to matter. Yet small habits have an advantage. We can actually keep them. That matters more to me now than grand promises. I have lived long enough to see people begin ambitious health plans on Monday and abandon them before the month ends. I would rather see someone take a 10-minute walk every day than promise to become an athlete next week. I would rather see a lonely person call one friend than buy another expensive wellness product. And I would rather see someone protect 5 peaceful minutes than spend an hour worrying about whether they are doing enough. But knowing this is one thing. Turning it into a life you can actually follow is another, and that is where I want to take you next. If you were sitting at my kitchen table, I would not hand you a complicated schedule. I would ask you to look at tomorrow morning and choose one small place where you can make life a little kinder to your mind. Perhaps when you wake up, you leave the television and phone alone for the first few minutes and give one thing your full attention. Perhaps you take a gentle walk around your street, even if it is only for 10 minutes and only at a pace that feels comfortable and safe for you. If walking is difficult, I would want you to talk with a healthcare professional about what kind of movement is appropriate rather than forcing yourself. At lunchtime, perhaps you call someone instead of eating in complete isolation. You do not need a crowded restaurant. A daughter, neighbor, friend, or grandchild on the telephone can still give the meal a human voice. Then choose one activity that makes you curious. I still keep books beside my chair because I like discovering something I did not know yesterday. You might prefer knitting, music, gardening, cards, drawing, cooking, or learning something you thought you were too old to learn. Let yourself be a beginner. That is not embarrassing. It is wonderful. In the afternoon, notice whether you have spent hours being mentally passive. If you have, do not criticize yourself. Simply give your mind something gentle to do. Read a few pages, write a letter, work on a puzzle, tell a story to someone younger than you. Memory is not only about remembering facts, it is also about remaining connected to your own life. In the evening, make sleep easier rather than treating it like an enemy. Try keeping your waking time reasonably consistent. Give yourself a quieter period before bed, and speak with a healthcare professional if sleep problems are persistent, severe, or new. And somewhere in that day, make room for peace. 5 minutes is enough to begin. I often sit in my garden and take slow breaths while listening to the wind. I do not count perfectly. I do not perform a technique. I simply stop rushing. These are not prescriptions, and I am not saying they will prevent memory loss or guarantee independence. I am sharing what I have observed and what has helped me build a life that still feels engaged. The beautiful thing is that none of these habits requires you to become a different person. They ask you to return to parts of yourself that may have become quieter. But there is one final thing I want you to understand, because without it, all 7 habits can feel like chores. I began this story by telling you that I had watched people age in very different ways, and I want to return to that thought now, because I understand it differently than I did when I was younger. I no longer believe that growing older is a contest where some people win and others lose. I have seen too much life for that. I have seen strong people become sick. I have seen fragile people surprise everyone. I have seen families carry one another through years nobody expected. Genetics matter. Medical conditions matter. Access to care matters. Luck matters. I cannot change any of those truths. What I can say is that our ordinary days still contain choices. I can choose to listen instead of constantly switching my attention. I can choose to walk when my body allows it. I can choose to share a meal or make a phone call instead of letting another day pass in isolation. I can choose to keep one small hobby alive. I can choose to read, learn, play, create, or ask questions. I can choose to take sleep seriously, rather than laughing it off as something old people simply endure. And I can choose to give my mind a few peaceful minutes instead of carrying every worry into the night. None of these choices is a guarantee. I want to be very clear about that. They are simply ways I have learned to support the kind of life I want to keep living. At my age, independence means more to me than having a perfect memory. It means being able to sit with someone and hear their story. It means knowing what I enjoy. It means having somewhere to go in the morning, even if that place is only my garden. It means still being curious about the world. And perhaps most importantly, it means knowing that I am not finished simply because I have become old. If you recognize yourself in one of these habits, please do not turn that recognition into fear. Turn it into a beginning. You do not have to fix your whole life tomorrow. Choose one small thing, repeat it, let it become ordinary. Then, when you are ready, add another. That is how I have approached these later years. Not with panic, but with patience. Not with promises of miracles, but with the quiet hope that tomorrow can still contain something worth doing. If you found comfort or a useful idea in my story, subscribe to this channel and stay with me. I will keep sharing the simple lessons I have gathered through a very long life, because I believe there is still much good ahead for all of us, no matter how many birthdays we have already celebrated.